In the previous video, we compared two different conceptualizations of power, highlighted by sociologist Patricia Collins, the dialectical approach and the subjectivity approach. Regardless of whether one looks at power through the lens of a single dialectical system or through that of subjectively experienced intersecting oppressions, Collins observed that any particular matrix of domination is organized through four domains of power, and each domain serves a particular function. What we're going to do is examine each of these domains of power. The first is the structural domain. The function or purpose of this domain of power is to organize oppression. This domain examines the interlocking social institutions that reproduce oppression, such as the legal system, labor markets, the media, schools, housing, banking, healthcare, and many others. All of these institutions interlock with one another, and all of them have been set up in such a way as to include some groups and exclude others. For example, while segregation in the form of the separate but equal Jim Crow policies are now officially illegal, segregation itself persists, and it's found within all of these institutions. And this would be segregation not only in terms of race, but also class, gender, sexual orientation, and other sources of social division. What this segregation ends up doing is excluding people from exercising their full human rights and dignity. In our post-Jim Crow era, this domain of power has employed a much more subtle form of oppression. We now like to speak of equality in terms of treating everyone the same, regardless of the differences people bring with them due to the effects of past discrimination or discrimination within other institutions. Colorblindness and gender neutrality are the most common examples. The assumption is that by ignoring race and racial differences, for example, or gender and gender differences, equality is guaranteed when it clearly is not. Those who consider themselves blind to differences in color or gender or sexual orientation or class, therefore see those who fail within our society as somehow to blame for their own failure, or their group culture is at fault, something we saw in our consideration of the culture of poverty ideology. Basically, colorblindness is a form of camouflaged racism, and the same can be said of gender neutrality and other forms of ignoring the relevance of difference. So this represents the structural domain, which organizes oppression. Next, there's the disciplinary domain of power. While the structural domain organizes oppression, the disciplinary domain manages it. The disciplinary domain is characterized by bureaucratic organizational structures and processes that serve to control populations, reproduce intersecting oppressions, and mask their effects. Marginalized peoples must play the game in order to advance through the organizational system, and all the while there are the privileged who often act as gatekeepers, deciding who to allow in, who to allow to advance, and how far. Organizational policies are no longer explicitly sexist, racist, heterosexist, or classist. Except for sexual orientation in some parts of the country, that's illegal. However, the way in which organizations are run serves to manage power relations in such a way as to perpetuate inequality. It does so by creating quiet, orderly, docile, and disciplined members of marginalized groups who fear to rock the boat. A key feature of this domain of power is surveillance. Everyone knows their behavior is being watched and evaluated, and there's always someone else further up the bureaucratic hierarchy watching those just beneath them. Those who fail to conform to narrow organizational expectations will not be able to advance in their careers. As a result, those who do advance are those marginalized individuals who have been deemed acceptable by those in ultimate power, who are largely white, straight, male, and affluent. And those individuals from marginalized groups who do advance ultimately participate in the surveillance and control of those others beneath them, becoming enforcers of the existing status quo. So then you have women and people of color, for example, who become gatekeepers themselves. In essence, they've been co-opted by the system. All right, these are the characteristics of the disciplinary domain of power. Then there's the hegemonic domain of power. While the structural domain organizes oppression and the disciplinary domain manages it, the hegemonic domain justifies oppression. The way this is done is through the use of culture, ideology, and consciousness. In other words, there are many common sense ideas about race, gender, sexual orientation, class, and so on that are so embedded in our culture and consciousness that we hardly notice them. Hegemonic power is deeply embedded within the major institutions of our society. Our education systems, religious teachings, community cultures, and family histories are all responsible for manufacturing the ideologies needed to maintain oppression. For example, school curricula routinely disregard marginalized and oppressed peoples as social actors. Religious teachings may preach love and equality, and yet are often used to justify exclusion. However, it's the mass media that seems to be growing in its influence and sophistication in this regard. The media is a powerful tool that shapes our perceptions of marginalized groups. As we saw with the topic of controlling images, which also comes from the work of Patricia Collins, even so-called positive representations often rely on and perpetuate stereotypical images of gender, sexual orientation, race, and class. If these images are disbelieved, racist, sexist, and homophobic ideologies lose their impact. So, an important feature of the hegemonic domain of power is that it must continually refashion these ideologies in order to stay current and maintain ongoing belief. Also, such beliefs require endorsement by members of the subjugated groups themselves. In other words, internalized racism, sexism, classism, and homophobia are important to maintaining power structures. This means that they are exploited by those in power in order to preserve the status quo. Overall, it is through the hegemonic domain of power that the existing system of oppression gains legitimacy. Finally, there's the interpersonal domain of power. It's here that you'll find oppression influencing our consciousness and our everyday lived experiences. All of us have internalized the hegemonic ideologies we identified before. This means that we often perpetuate them in our interactions with others, even if unwittingly. So, the interpersonal domain of power focuses on the day-to-day ways in which people relate to and treat one another. Such practices are so familiar that they often go unnoticed. They often take the form of microaggressions. Ultimately, what this means is that oppression shapes our very consciousness and everyday experiences. Remember that the matrix of domination tells us that oppression is contextual and a matter of degree. The implication of this understanding of oppression is that there are very few pure victims or pure oppressors. Collins points out that while it's often easy to identify one's own victimization, it's much more difficult to recognize how we participate in oppressing others on some other dimension of the matrix. For example, many white feminists are quick to point to their own oppression as women while completely forgetting the white privilege they enjoy compared to women of color. In the same way, leftist activists are so focused on issues of class that they think other marginalized groups should somehow be willing to overlook the racism, sexism, and homophobia they have to face every day. So, Collins tells us that to the extent that any group holds one form of oppression above all others, they will continue to exercise domination over others. That's so important, I'm going to say it again. To the extent that any group holds one form of oppression above all others, they will continue to exercise domination over others. Okay, so we've been distinguishing between 4 different domains of power. It's important to study these domains carefully in order to see how power operates at many different levels and in many different ways to oppress people. However, this kind of knowledge can also overwhelm us with feelings of helplessness. How can we ever hope to change the world when you have entrenched systems of power such as these? Collins, however, takes care to point out that understanding these domains of power also serves to highlight important paths to empowerment, and this is what we'll focus on in the next video.